Okay, we are at the stomach. So we're talking about the digestive system. We were discussing the cardiac sphincter, and then the food moves past it and into the stomach. And then I was telling you that we call it the cardiac sphincter because this region of the stomach is the cardia. Not that it's anything I would ask you on, so you don't really need to know the regions of the stomach for the test. But just keep it in mind that this region back here at the end is called the pylorus or pyloric region. This is called the cardia. This is kind of the body of the stomach. Anyway, let's look at the stomach. So here's the esophagus. Here's the cardiac sphincter, which you can't really see on this. The food moves past it, and it goes into the stomach. The stomach is acidic, has a pH of around 2. So remember, the lower the number, the more acidic. So it's very acidic, but the stomach is lined with a good layer of mucus, and that protects the stomach from the acid. The esophagus does not have that protection, and neither does the small intestine. So right here is the small intestine. So you have two sphincters. So one right here at the end, which is called the pyloric sphincter or pyloric valve. And then you have another one right here, which is not really shown. It's called the cardiac sphincter, right? And so the cardiac sphincter is to keep the acid from going back up into your esophagus. That's what's happening to people when they have heartburn or reflux, whatever you want to call it. And that's what's going on. You can get like an ulcer up in the esophagus. You could also get an ulcer in the stomach, like a peptic ulcer, if the mucus starts to wear away, and then that acid is touching up against the epithelial tissue without any protection. You can ulcerate the stomach, or even there's such things as duodenal. This is the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, a duodenal ulcer, right? But anyway, let's get back to the stomach. Something I want you to notice about the stomach, there are 3 layers of smooth muscle here. So circular, longitudinal, just like everywhere else, and there's an oblique layer, a diagonal layer. So the stomach, unlike the rest of the GI tract, has 3 layers of smooth muscle because the function of the stomach is to liquefy food. It turns it into something called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. So you're turning the bolus into chyme. A chyme is like a slushy consistency, right? So you want to liquefy it because ultimately you want to get everything good out of it. So it's much easier to do when you've liquefied the food. So that's the main job of the stomach, right? So the stomach's going to liquefy this, and how it does it is that the food, the bolus, is dropping into a bunch of acid, an acid bath, right? So the food drops into acid, that's physically breaking it up, and then you have 3 layers of muscle in the muscularis that's really bashing the food around, and that's breaking it up. It's dropping into a bunch of acid, and it's getting like sloshed around, right? It's like this. So here it comes down past the cardiac sphincter into all this acid here, and it's getting sloshed back and forth. And that's going to break up the food. And notice the pyloric sphincter here. So the pyloric sphincter, its job is not necessarily to prevent backflow, because that's not like a big deal that you have a backflow of food from the intestine into the stomach. I mean, it rarely happens, but no, here it's different. So remember, this is acid. So you don't want the acid going too quickly into the small intestine. So right here where I've got the pointer, this is the small intestine. So you don't want it going too fast. For one, it's acidic, so you don't want to put a whole bunch in there because it's going to burn a hole. So you just want to put coincidentally have a bottle cap. This bottle cap full of chyme, that's how much goes into the small intestine. That's how much the stomach lets through at a time, about 3 milliliters. And so a rule of thumb, 5 milliliters is like a teaspoon, right? So very small amount, right? And so one, because it's acidic, you don't want to let a bunch of acid into the small intestine. And two, the small intestine is going to absorb all the nutrients. So you don't want to dump nutrients. You don't want to dump all that chyme into the small intestine because the small intestine will not be able to do its job. But back to the stomach. So there we are, stomach. You notice that the wall of the stomach, like the epithelial tissue, is not smooth. It's actually made of pits. So here's the epithelial tissue, here's the mucosa, like the mucosal layer, and you see that they go down into pits. And so these are like columnar cells. And you notice that these cells, they're kind of like different colors in here. So there's different kinds of cells within these pits. So we're not really, I mean, yes, the muscularis has 3 layers of muscle instead of 2, so that's different. Submucosa, nothing to say about that. The mucosa is different. It's not just smooth. There's pits going down into it. And those pits have different kinds of cells. And so these are the cells. The first 2 on top, for me personally, I don't really differentiate between them, surface and mucus. They're both mucus cells, whether they're neck cells or surface cells, whatever. Mucus cells. Mucus cells secrete mucus. That's it. Parietal cells, as it says here, secrete the acid, hydrochloric acid. And they secrete something called intrinsic factor. I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but you need intrinsic factor to absorb vitamin B12. So if you see like older people freaking out about not getting enough B12, it's not because they don't actually eat enough, it's because their stomach's jacked up and they're not making intrinsic factor or enough. So anyway, parietal cell makes hydrochloric acid. Chief cell makes pepsinogen. So here we are again with this OGEN. Remember, OGEN is like a precursor. And what's the enzyme? Pepsin. So remember, enzymes speed up reactions. So the type of reactions that are going on here in the digestive system are all catabolic reactions, breaking down food. So enzymes speed up the reaction. You will never break down your food without the enzymes, right? So technically speaking, enzymes are catalysts. They speed up the breakdown of food. But, that's technically, really without the enzyme, it's never going to happen. So to give you an example, amylase is an enzyme made by your saliva. And I'm going to have it in another slide. You don't have to write it down now. And amylase is an enzyme made in your saliva, and it breaks down starch. And so without amylase, it would take your body 2 years to break down starch. With amylase, it takes like a couple minutes. So that's the difference that an enzyme makes. So much so that we really just say enzymes make things happen, right? So I'm saying here that the enzyme pepsin breaks down protein. The enzyme lipase breaks down lipid. Let me go off topic just for a second. There's something that you should know that might be on a test. There's 3 molecules that you're eating in food. And I probably talked about this before, but carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. Those are the 3 molecules that you're getting from different food. So if you think about bacon, lipids, proteins, right? Muscles, protein. Think about pancakes, right? It's starch, so that's a carbohydrate. And then anything that tastes sweet is a carbohydrate. So the syrup, sugar, that's a carbohydrate, right? So carbs, lipids, proteins. So whatever enzyme we're discussing, it's targeting one of those three molecules, right? So pepsin breaks down proteins. Lipase breaks down lipids, fats. So chief cells secrete pepsinogen. Why not pepsin? Why is a chief cell not just secreting the enzyme? Why does it have to secrete an inactive form? Because the cell itself is made up of proteins. So if you secrete an enzyme that breaks up protein, it's going to turn around and break up the cell that made it. So you got to make it inactive. So when that pepsinogen, so like follow my, here's the chief cell, follow my pointer here, pepsinogen is coming up here, and then it meets the acid here in the lumen. The acid is going to activate it and turn it into pepsin. Normally, enzymes cannot handle acid. So, for example, the amylase made in your saliva, when it reaches your stomach, denatured, right? Gone. Pepsin is a unique enzyme that can withstand the low pH. Gastric lipase as well. Gastric lipase is not like a big player in the stomach. Really, it's mostly pepsin. And then you have G cells, which secrete a hormone called gastrin, which we're going to talk about in another lecture. So we've got different types of cells in this in the stomach. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Well, no, I guess I'm going to do it now. All right. Here's the stomach. All right, the stomach's removed from this photo here because I want to show you the accessory organs. So the stomach, let's go back to this stomach here. The stomach liquefies the food. The small intestine is going to absorb all the vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, proteins, things like that. And that happens in the small intestine. Okay? So there are, so let's see, let me find a good photo. So here's that small intestine right here. The stomach's gone. So like here, right here where the pointer is, that would be like the pyloric sphincter. And then here's the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum or duodenum, however you want to call it. Both are correct. And so what I want you to see here is the three accessory organs, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. They're not part of the gastrointestinal tract. They're not part of the GI tract. But if you notice here, here's the liver, and there's ducts running, and if you follow this green duct down, it goes into the small intestine. Same thing here with the gallbladder, and same thing here with the pancreas. So all three of these things are secreting something into the small intestine. And so the next slide discusses what these are. So the liver produces something called bile, and as you can read here, bile emulsifies fats. So we're going to go back a slide. The liver, among the many things that the liver does, makes bile. And bile emulsify fats. It means that bile takes big drops of fat and makes them into little drops of fat so that the enzyme lipase, so that the enzyme can get to it and break it up. Lipase, which is the enzyme that breaks up lipids, can't break down fat like in how it naturally exists or how it exists like in your stomach, right? It's liquid. It's liquid, but the molecule's too big, like the droplets are too big, so you got to get them smaller, and that's what bile does. You're not always eating fats and oils, and so when you don't need the bile, it's going to come up, and you're going to store it in the gallbladder. And then if you need a lot of extra bile for some reason, then your gallbladder can contract and push extra bile down the cystic duct and ultimately into the duodenum. So that's the liver and the gallbladder. So the gallbladder doesn't make bile, it stores bile. And by the way, synthesize, just in case you don't know the word, that means to make, right? It's always, synthesize is always used. Hope you guys don't hear my wife in there. I told her I was making a video. She just doesn't. It's a small house, and we're all stuck in here. Let's talk about the pancreas. Bicarbonate and digestive enzymes. All right, so there's a pancreas. Stomach's right here. You lift the stomach, like stomach's like right here, right? And if you lift it up, the pancreas is like right there. So it's it makes two types of things, like bicarbonate and enzymes. So coming from the stomach is acid. So remember that chyme from the stomach is now going into the duodenum. It's acid. It's got a pH of 2. So coming here from the pancreas is bicarbonate, which has a pH of 8.4. Right? And so they buffer each other. The sodium bicarbonate, which is like baking soda, is going to is like an antacid. So the pancreas makes like an antacid called bicarbonate, and of course it makes a bunch of enzymes as well. So, and I don't know if you remember the pancreas. We talked about it in the endocrine system. We talked about like insulin and glucagon, stuff like that. So yes, it makes hormones, but here it's an exocrine gland, right? It's what also makes enzymes and bicarbonate. And you might be wondering, what enzymes does the pancreas make exactly? Well, there is your list. So, I'm not going to read it to you. I would like you to notice that out of this list, which is not all inclusive, I didn't put everything in there, but you'll see that 4 of the 6 enzymes here are for proteins. So your body spends a lot of time breaking down proteins compared to carbohydrates and lipids, right? So if you eat oil, things with high fat, your body's got no problem putting that away, right? Carbohydrates like simple sugars, your body loves that. You can take that all day. Fat and sugar, cake frosting, your body can put that away all day. Keep it coming. It'll put it away for you. Proteins, your body needs to slow down. So proteins make you feel the fullest, the most satiated, right? So if you're going for something that is going to make you feel full with maybe fewer calories, I would go with like chicken breast or something, something that's proteins but not a lot of fat with it, right? Bacon's not a great idea. Sausages aren't a good idea. But proteins make you feel the fullest, right? It shuts your body down. There's like a delay once you eat, between the time you eat and then the time that the signals are sent up to your brain, to your hypothalamus saying, hey, knock it off, I'm full. There's a little delay there, and in that short time, you and I can shovel a hell of a lot of food down. I can get another plate down me in the time it takes my body to reach my brain, right? So it'd be nice to have things in your body that trigger that mechanism faster, right? So proteins do that. I want you to know these enzymes, and I want you to know the substrate. The substrate is the thing that the enzyme works on, right? So these are all the substrates. We talked about pepsin. That's not on that list on this slide, because pepsin is made by the stomach. There's going to be 3 more enzymes that are going to be produced by the small intestine. And so I have it listed here at the second bullet point. And if you remember anything from biology, the 3 disaccharides are maltose, sucrose, lactose. Right? Lactose is milk sugar. Anyway, So those are the enzymes that break down lactose, sucrose, and maltose, right? So those are all made by the small intestine. And we'll get to the brush border in a minute. So I want you to know, this slide. I already see some spelling mistakes, but I'm just going to go with it because I'm recording. Protein substrate produced by the stomach, and then down here, lipase and amylase produced by salivary glands as well as the pancreas. And actually, if you remember, it's lipase is also produced in the stomach. So it's produced in 3 different places. The bulk of it, the bulk of lipase comes from your pancreas. So the other 2 are kind of inconsequential. So let me show you the small intestine right here. So you remember how the stomach had these pits that went down? The small intestine has what are called villi, or singular is villus, right? But many of them are villi, V-I-L-L-I. So same columnar epithelial cells, but here inside the villus, you find the blood supply and a lacteal, which is a lymphatic capillary. If you remember the functions of the lymphatic system, one of the functions is to carry lipids. So lipids will go cross through the epithelial cells and go into the lacteal. Proteins cross into the bloodstream right here at the villi. Amino acids, carbohydrates, they cross in the same place. And so this is where all the nutrients and stuff are going to finally enter the bloodstream in the villi. So how is the small intestine adapted to do its job? And what its job is to absorb things. Well, what makes the small intestine so special that it can absorb stuff? Well, it has villi. At the top of these villi, let me see if I got it right here. At the top of these villi, there's microvilli. So it looks like the villi have little villi on them, right? So the job of the villi and microvilli is to increase the surface area. That's what villi does. Increase the surface area. Microvilli, increase surface area. You want as much surface area as you can to absorb stuff. So there's 3 things that make the small intestine specialized for absorption: villi, microvilli, and then circular folds. Circular folds force the chyme in a circular motion. So I've got like this glass candle thing here. I'm going to use it, right? So if you imagine this thing were filled with some liquid, the liquid would all be down here, right? And not up here. So if this were an intestine, because you're like standing up and the chyme is flowing through like that, like where my hand is and under my hand, but what about all up here? You're missing this part, and this part can't absorb things. So circular folds make that chyme go like this as it goes through, like spirals through it. And so that is going to make sure that all parts of the intestine get an equal opportunity to absorb the chyme. So villi, microvilli, circular folds. The villi are so tiny that when you look under a microscope, you can't make them out. It looks like a brush, hairbrush. All right, that's what it looks like under a microscope. So we call this the brush border, the microvilli. It's like another name for it, brush border. So those are where the 3 enzymes are made: lactase, maltase, sucrase. They're made by the microvilli of the small intestine, the brush border. For me, I don't care if you know what these cells do or don't do. So I'm going to skip ahead because I've already used up a lot of time. Here's the villi, and or like the microvilli, and then here's like the like a cell, like a endoepithelial cell. This is just showing you the smallest, like I was telling you, the 3 types of molecules that we eat are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. From carbs, whatever carb you eat, you have to break it down into the smallest molecule, which is called a monosaccharide. You have to break it down into the smallest carbohydrate you can. And the smallest carbohydrate is like fructose or glucose or galactose. And you don't have to, like, if you don't know that already, it's okay. Glucose, you should know. That's a very common word, right? Blood sugar, blood glucose, right? And that's, so if you eat bread, that's starch, or bananas, that's starch, potatoes. That all gets broken down into like glucose, right? And it's the glucose that's going to go into your bloodstream. Well, you need enzymes to break all that stuff down. And same thing with proteins. I envision proteins to be like chains, and the links of the chain are amino acids. So, many amino acids hooked together make a protein. So whenever you eat steak or beans, you have to break them down into amino acids, and it's the amino acids that are going to enter your bloodstream. And then fat's a little more complicated, but as you can see here, most of it, the fatty part of it, the triglyceride part, it enters the lymphatic system. I'm just going to let you look at that. I'm not going to really ask you any questions on that. This is just kind of showing you the different types of fluid that you produce and how much you make. Small intestine. I'm not going to give you a lot on this, because now I'm trying to wrap this lecture up. But the small intestine is ending right here, and this is the beginning of the large. And there's another valve or sphincter. It's called the ileocecal sphincter. There's no test question on that. But here's the last part of the small intestine, called the ileum. Here's the first part of the large intestine. There's your appendix. So it ascends, the colon goes up, transverses, comes back down, and then it makes a sigmoid, which is like, that letter for sum in math, it's like half of that. They call that like a sigmoid. So that's where that word comes from. Actually, I don't even have a slide on this to show you, but the large intestine reclaims water. So if the chyme were to go through this really fast, you'd have diarrhea. If it goes through really slow, the opposite, constipation. So ideally, you want to reabsorb 80 to 90% of the water that enters the small intestine, because your stomach is actually donating water. So pretend you ate like a whole box of goldfish crackers, right? No, and you're not drinking anything. That's it. That's all you do. You're just eating those crackers. You're going to liquefy those crackers. So your stomach is going to donate water. Your body is donating water to the stomach to get this done. But you need that water back. In that case, in the example I gave you, you didn't have water to spare, right? So you need it back. So that's an issue with diarrhea, because you're not claiming the water back. You're going to get dehydrated pretty quick. So that's my last slide on that. That was a rather long lecture, I admit. But take a look at the slides, know the enzymes and the substrates, know the function of the stomach and why the stomach can do that, know the function of the small intestine and how is the small intestine, what are the features of the small intestine that allow it to do its job, which is absorption. Know the 3 accessory organs. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.